Thank you, Herman. It's great to be here. Also great to see Amar Samwal again. Thanks, Amar, for twisting my arm to come here and to help with bringing the Indian delegation here. So I'm really happy they were.
Thank your arm for being twisted.
I'm really happy that there's a very strong group of Indian economists who have come here, and so I'm excited to hear all the discussion. As many of you know, over the last few years, I've sort of reoriented my research program to focus back on India after being absent from India for many years. So, and as I came back to looking at India, I began to realize that the broader narrative around India that you hear about high levels of poverty, high levels of rural poverty, high levels of malnutrition, high levels of child stunting, etc., 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 is all true, but there's enormous diversity that's completely missed out when we talk about India as India. And what the message I want to give you is India is not India. India is actually a collection of many federated states. And each federated state in India has its own development experience, which is quite different from the development experiences of other states in India. So if I take you to Punjab, the experience of development of Punjab is very, very different from the experience of development of Bihar. And what I want to do in this paper is actually to put forward that whole scenario of development that's taking place, the diversity in development that's taking place, and also to characterize the changes that have been happening in that process. So let me start by saying, where are we today? And here, oh, now I got myself into trouble. There. Now, I'm not sure you can read this carefully, but what I tried to do here is to put the states of India in terms of their state-level GDP per capita in PPP terms relative to the per capita incomes of the various regions of the world. And so if you look down there, you'll find that there are few states in India such as Bihar and UP, etc., Jharkhand, which actually have GDP levels which are which are lower than the average GDP of sub-Saharan Africa. On the other hand, you've got several states, such as Punjab and Karnataka, Gujarat, etc., where GDP levels are very similar to Southeast Asia. And then you've got states, cities like Delhi or states like Goa, which have GDP levels which are higher than Latin America. So there's very significant differences in the level of incomes. And I want you to take another look at it. And here, just for fun, I put in countries. And people from Bihar will hate me for doing this, but I show that Bihar actually has GDP levels which are really very low and compared to some of the lowest income countries in the world. Whereas you'll find that some other countries, some other states in India have GDP levels very comparable to Southeast Asia, not some just above Thailand, but many between Indonesia, Philippines, etc. There's one point here which I think is important, and that's striking both in terms of both Goa and Delhi. As you see urbanization happening, and Goa is pretty much an urbanized state, and Delhi, of course, is a city, the extent to which per capita income increases is quite tremendous. And I'll come back to that in a minute, but just keep that point in view. Now, state-wise, what's happening to poverty reduction? You see across the board there's been fairly dramatic drop in poverty, but you'll find that about half the states have seen a very sharp drop in poverty relative to the lagging states. So if you look at this table, you'll find that pretty much every state from Karnataka down has been able to achieve, if you did the MDGs at state level, has been able to achieve the MDGs. Whereas the states above Karnataka UP, Madhya Pradesh, etc., are still lagging behind in poverty reduction. Now, I want to come back to the urbanization story. There's a lot of talk around that the locus of poverty has moved from rural to urban areas. But the reality is, if you look at the data shows that poverty levels in urban areas in India are actually quite low, even though visibility is very high, because you may see some slums and you may see beggars on the street. But the reality of the data is poverty levels in urban India are significantly lower and have dropped dramatically over the decades compared to rural poverty. So poverty continues to be a rural phenomenon and not an urban phenomenon, despite the rhetoric about the locus of poverty shifting to urban areas. And I think that's something really interesting that comes out. The other thing that comes out is the malnutrition story. When you look at where malnutrition is, and I'm looking at two types of malnutrition here. One is the extent to which you have stunting, under 5 stunting of children, and that's your y-axis. And the x-axis shows you the percentage of overweight adults. And what happens when you look at states that have been lagging behind in poverty reduction and in overall income growth, you find states like Bihar, Jharkhand, etc., have very high percentage of underweight populations and very high levels of stunted children, etc. But as you go towards the more progressive states, the more higher income states of India, you find that switch going on from underweight to overweight adults taking place. And that's a very interesting switch that you begin to see, and it's systematically there across states as you see income levels going up. One other interesting fact that you see here, we've taken some survey data from the NFHS surveys to look at the percentage of households that have both at the same time an underweight household member and an overweight household member. So that the sort of dual burden that you begin to see in populations. And you find again that dual burden increases as incomes of the states increase. And so the lower income states tend to be very focused on underweight, malnutrition, stunting, etc. But as incomes rise in the same households, you begin to see obesity levels also rising. And so there's this urgency for us to address both of these problems at the same time is something that's becoming very important now. So then I went out and I said, let's look at what's happening to the structural transformation process. And so I took the data from all of the states and looked across time and just plotted it out. And you get one of these graphs that Peter Timmer usually puts together, which show all the countries in the world. But here it's showing you the states in India and showing the way in which the transformation process has been happening across the states in India. And as you would predict, as you go towards the lower right-hand side, you've got most of the high-income states. And as you go up to the upper left-hand sides, you have many of the lower-income states. And so you have this beautiful, smooth transformation. And the message that comes out of this is, there large parts of the country have been going through a fairly dramatic structural transformation, while at the same time, there are significant parts of the country where the transformation has not yet occurred. So both stories are there, both stories are very clear. And so then we want to say, okay, let's look at them a bit more closely. And so you find, if you look even at just the last 2 decades, you had most of the states of India up in the right-hand 2 columns there, with between over 20%, but mainly over 30% of GDP coming from, state GDP coming from agriculture. But as you come to the most recent time periods, you find that majority of the states now have less than 20% of their GDP coming from agriculture. So there's that transformation happening very clearly. A couple of interesting things that come out of looking at this table. One is there are certain states in India which have had phenomenally high agriculture productivity growth. And so if we think about agriculture-driven development process, one would have expected to see a sharper drop in their share of agriculture in GDP. I'm thinking specifically of a state like Punjab or a state like Andhra Pradesh. But what happens is these states continue to have high share of agriculture in GDP. And part of the reason for that is that because it's a country, they tend to specialize in agriculture, whereas other states may diversify out of agriculture. And the second thing you begin to see is there's increased high-value agriculture coming in, which is also accounting for the rise in the share of agriculture in GDP. On the other hand, if you look at a state like Jharkhand or Orissa or Chhattisgarh, these are some of the poorest states in India. Yet you see a very sharp drop in the share of agriculture in GDP. Why is that the case? You shouldn't expect that. The reason it happens is some of these poorer states are also states which have very high levels of resource extraction, coal, for example. And so because of that increased emphasis on coal and other minerals, you find the state GDP rising and the share of agriculture in that falling. There's a whole Dutch disease issues around the mineral extraction that I'll come back to in a minute. So let me not worry about that. So what I tried to do was to say, okay, there's all these different experiences going on. Is there a way to characterize states by these experiences? So I tried to look at states, basically most of them have agriculture as their base, but then look at characterizing them relative to the extent to which they have industry. And the Indian data, when they say industry, it includes mining. Mining comes into industry also. And then the service sector. How much, whether the service sector is high or low, whether industry is high or low. And so based on that, coming up with classifications of states which are agriculture-driven states versus service-driven states versus mining and industry-driven states versus industry and service-driven states, and try to plot them in that manner. And you can see, we'll go through some of that in more detail in a minute. So this gives us a basis for having a little bit more of a discussion on what they look like. So here we have, in agriculture, actually, I had to break it down even further. I had to break it down between low productive agriculture states versus high productive agriculture states. And so you've got right on top, Bihar, MP, UP, West Bengal are much more low productive states, whereas Punjab, Andhra Pradesh, etc., much more high productive agriculture. So there's a difference between them. And then there's the high industry growth states, high service growth states, and then the resource-driven states, as I mentioned, resources such as coal, etc., which are Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Rajasthan, Orissa, etc. And when you look at them, and you try to look at what happened to poverty, you find that poverty reduction has been highest in states which have had high agriculture growth rate and high service growth rates. These are the true areas where you've seen a very sharp drop in poverty levels, whereas you haven't seen as much of a drop in poverty levels in states which more recently have started to push for industrialization, or states which were resource driven, and states which have had low agriculture productivity. So then I then went in and I tried to look at, through this classification, what's been the experience of the agriculture sector. And I'd go through this very fast because I know we're running out of time. One of the most important things that comes out is that if you look at the graph on the right-hand side, you find that the states which are high agriculture performing states, not surprisingly, have had very high yield growth across these years, and especially staple crop yield growths have been very high. You also find labor productivity of the high agriculture productivity states has been double or sometimes even triple the labor productivity of the low performing states. Fertilizer use, again, substantially higher in the high performing states, but also high in the service driven states also. High yielding varieties, again. Now, here's something very interesting. When you standardize the area by irrigated area, you find that the extent to which high yielding varieties are adopted is fairly similar across states when you have irrigation in place. And if you account for irrigation, where you just look at overall area in the state, then the high performing states have higher levels of high yielding variety adoption. Market infrastructure is another fairly striking result that comes out. For high performing states, rural market infrastructure investments took place very early and have been significantly higher than all other categories of states. But worryingly, I think more recently, there hasn't been as much investment in rural market infrastructure as there ought to be, so you begin to see some drop in overall market access as measured in terms of number of markets per square kilometer or number of markets per certain number of agriculture workers, etc. So that's an area where further emphasis needs to take place. Now let me talk a little bit about the other aspect of the structural transformation process, which is the share of agriculture in employment. And when you look at the data on share of agriculture in employment, and this comes from the agriculture census data, you see that at a national level, the share of agriculture in overall employment has actually dropped from 57% to less than 30%. This is despite the common rhetoric that 70% of labor is in agriculture. Okay? That rhetoric is not in line with the data that comes out from the agriculture censuses. But you also see that over time, across states, you see the share of agriculture in employment dropping quite a lot. And a majority of the states actually have less than 30% of the share of employment that's accounted for by agriculture. A couple of interesting points to make here. One is there are still high-performing states with very high share of agriculture and employment. Andhra Pradesh is one of them. And Maharashtra is another one of them. And the reason for that is in these states, you're beginning to see a migration towards high-value agriculture, which also tends to be labor-intensive. And therefore, high-value agriculture continues to be a source of new employment for these populations. On the other hand, you have states like Jharkhand, which is a really poor, low-productive agriculture state, which has a very low share of agriculture and employment. And you see the similar thing for Orissa, West Bengal, etc. And that's puzzling, but it can be explained primarily because a large part of the labor force in these states is being sucked into the resource extraction industries. It's being sucked into mining, it's been sucked into forestry products, etc. And because of that, and because those are sort of the higher performing income earning opportunities in the state, there's been much less attention placed on improving agriculture productivity in those states, and that's where the turnaround needs to be happening. Just quickly, wage rates are rising across the board in India, and Jikun, I think your figures for India are quite low compared to the reality, which is quite significant. In real terms, wage rates in India have gone up about 3 times in the last 20 years. And they've gone up across the country, but you do see the high-performing states, high-performing agriculture states, and the service states to have much higher wage rates relative to the low-performing agriculture states and to the resource-driven states. And that's true both for male labor as well as female labor. Okay, I don't want to take much time on this, but just to make the point that which I made earlier, as you think about the malnutrition problem, the problem of stunting and underweight, etc., is becoming increasingly concentrated in a few states, in the lagging states of India, the ones which have the very dark color. That's why much of the problem is becoming concentrated, and there's improvements happening in the other states in the country. And the latest round of the National Family Health Survey, which is the DHS survey for India, the results which are coming out, and here are some preliminary results, show that the high-performing states in India have seen a fairly dramatic drop in anemia levels, in low BMI levels, but they also show a fairly sharp increase in BMI for women. So overweight and obesity levels for women rising in the higher performing states. So you're beginning to see both of these things coming together. And this is from the latest Family Health Survey which just came out last year. So what's the way forward? So as you look across these states, you begin to see that for the first two, the low productive agriculture and the resource-driven states, they have some similar sets of issues to be able to, that we need to deal with. And the other three, the agriculture-driven state and the service-driven states and the industry states, they have a set of issues that are relatively common across them. And I think as you look at this, and in the paper I'll be going through and doing a detailed discussion for each of these categories. But to sum it up in a few words, I think for the low-performing states, what we need to do is we need to say reinvest in agriculture as an engine of growth. I mean, that's the bottom line. You need to say, let's get agriculture back on track, let's get agriculture moving, but let's look at agriculture not just in terms of staple crop productivity improvement, but think about a broader base where maybe these low-performing states can leapfrog into Tom Reardon's supermarkets, if that's a possibility. So a new and innovative way of thinking about agriculture development in these states. And for the high-performing states, I think there we really need to look at how do you make agriculture competitive relative to other opportunities. So are there ways in which you can improve high-value agriculture systems, high value-added systems, etc., and linking farmers to markets, etc., in a way to make agriculture a worthwhile livelihood opportunity similar to opportunities outside of the agriculture sector. And that's true of the service and industry-driven states also, where the returns to labor for non-agriculture is rising quite rapidly. And so you need to look at ways in which labor investments, labor time in agriculture is equally compensated for. And you can only do that if you look at ways in which the returns to agriculture investments are higher, especially as you look at fruits, vegetables, other high-value products, etc. Sorry for rushing through this, but I had a few cross-cutting things, but I'll skip that for the moment in view of the time, and I'll stop here. Thank you.